Hello and welcome to episode 108 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Marmalith.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Campbell.
Good to talk to you all again and welcome to the show, Campbell.
Good to be here.
So you, Campbell, are one of the developers of Blender, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So what is Blender, first of all?
I mean, it's mainly 3D animation software, but we also do other things, video editing and sort of game content creation, asset creation for various tasks, and people often write extensions and integrate it into their own pipelines for their own tools for anything 3D related.
And this is not some kind of also ran, is it? This is one of the industry standard tools that is also completely free and open source.
Well, it seems to have become that way. I think there are still pipelines where people depend heavily on Maya or 3D Studio Max. It's not supported in every workflow, but it's become pretty popular in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's not the de facto standard, but it is like certainly up there as professional grade software.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
But you're very modest, Campbell, so we won't press that too much. We've actually got you on to talk about porting Blender to Wayland. So I suppose the question is, why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, well, since Wayland came out, I had been interested in getting it working on Blender, or getting Blender working on Wayland, but there were just various obstacles. So, for example, I had NVIDIA at the time, so I couldn't test it. And it's a reasonably big task as well. So as long as there's X-Wayland available, there wasn't any pressing need for us to have a Wayland version, although we knew that it would give a better user experience having native Wayland support. It wasn't that we really had to. It was just that I knew in the back of my head, like we should do this at some point. And there wasn't really anyone asking for it exactly. We just knew that eventually X11 was going away. And I had done some X11 maintenance, so I was aware of, just fixing bugs and supporting Linux users on X11. And so X11 has all sorts of problems, and I was aware of those. So I was hoping to upgrade to something more modern.
Now, when we first discussed this, me and the three guys, you lot said to me, although you are professional developers, you know nothing about Wayland and nothing about porting an application to Wayland.
Yep.
But that's kind of the position you were in, Campbell, right?
Basically, yes. Only other than having had experience looking at SDL and X11 and having had experience just fixing bugs and sometimes adding features here and there, I hadn't done anything with Wayland to speak of. And yeah, I was curious because I heard all this sort of arguments for and against Wayland. It seemed fairly controversial, and I was curious to find out what it was like what the big deal was. Why is this such a controversial topic? And it was really interesting to just, from having virtually no experience, to just jump in and try and get an X11 application running in Wayland. I should mention, just before I go further, I didn't actually do the initial Wayland port. Another developer did. I had looked into it a little early on, and I reviewed the code for the initial patch, which was written by Christian Rauch, and that was in 2022. So, and it stayed as a feature that was disabled by default for a couple of years until I started supporting it and brought it to a level where it could be enabled by default for users on Linux, which was quite a lot of work.
So my understanding of the way this would work is that for an application that was built on top of one of the standard frameworks, there might not be a lot of work to do to port to Wayland because the framework would do all the work. But is Blender on top of any framework, or is it straight against the underlying system?
It communicates with the underlying system directly.
So there's no Qt or GTK or anything like that?
That's right.
That's a lot of work.
Yes. That means we get the joy of writing against the Win32 APIs, which is like an exercise in code archaeology. And even X11 is quite hairy. There's some strange things you have to do to get it working properly.
But presumably you have greater performance as a result of that then?
I mean, technically, probably we do. I doubt you could really tell the difference.
Right.
The thing that it gives us that using a toolkit doesn't is we get a lot of flexibility, and that's the main reason we do it. We could use SDL, and I actually did write an experimental SDL backend to Blender, so Blender could just use SDL for all the systems. But we don't use it because we don't have that extra bit of flexibility that we end up using and that SDL doesn't provide. So only Haiku use the SDL backend, for example.
So SDL is a very, as I understand it, a very low level rendering library. So what is limiting about SDL that means that port can't be used everywhere?
Well, I have to be careful because SDL has recently added support for a whole lot of things that we could have used when we chose not to use it. But examples were at the time tablet support, multi-window,
right,
progress in the taskbar, things that maybe you could get working, but they would be a bit fiddly. Oh, another thing is input method editor. So when you start typing and then like an editor pops up for Asian languages, also for emoticons and other things, there's input method editors.
Building your own thing, it's very hard to roll back from that, isn't it? Because everything's the way you want it.
It really is, and it's frustrating because we even looked at just using SDL for Wayland, like fairly seriously, although at the time I thought like we're not going to do it because there's just enough features that SDL doesn't support, which is a shame. And maybe if a Blender developer had been more serious in being an SDL developer as well, it could have worked. So for all the features we didn't support, we could have integrated them into SDL.
So outside of not using a toolkit and talking directly to the underlying system, was there anything else that made Blender a particularly either easy or hard port to Wayland?
In principle, everything was really easy. It's almost like a game or a video player. It's just you have a big OpenGL surface, now of Volclan as well, but you have a GPU surface, you just draw to the window, you take events from the mouse and keyboard, and that's great. And getting that working in Wayland is really quite simple. And so all the issues and the complications come from everything else, all the other things that you have to support. And I could enumerate them, but there's a long tail, I suppose you could say, of just small features. As I was saying, like the input method editor, drag and drop, high DPI support, a whole lot of things.
I really know nothing about how any of this works. So I'd be really interested if you could talk about like an example maybe of a thing you did that made a change from how it worked before to how it worked with Wayland. Something
we do in Blender that I actually added a fairly long time ago, maybe 2007 or thereabouts, is cursor grabbing. Because at the time, screens were moving to 16:9 aspect ratio. We changed the layout, so we had a vertical bar on the right-hand side with all the buttons, but then people were dragging the buttons and their mouse was hitting the edge of the monitor. And because of this, look, there are multiple ways of solving it, but with 3D graphics, you often have buttons with very arbitrary ranges, like the location of an object. So it's not clear where it should begin and end, and people just want to click and drag and drag and drag. So I added cursor wrapping support, or other developers added it on other platforms, but I added it on Linux and other developers supported it on other platforms. And it's also nice for moving things in 3D space or panning around. You can just click and hold your mouse. You don't have to worry about it escaping the window. So that to support that on every system is actually very, very complicated. You think at first, I can just move the window to the center of the screen, but you've got things like events that have been put into the event queue that are already there that have to be processed before that event to reset the cursor location gets processed. So you need to check event timestamps.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It's really, really, really bad. And I was somewhat naive in thinking that I could just move the cursor to the center of the screen and just happy days, it's all working. It's really been a problem. There's even been fixes for Windows, at least in the last year, for this.
Right. So just to get my head around this a bit more. So in X11, you're calling in an API of the X libraries to say, give me the mouse motion events or something like that. And then you're calling another API to set the cursor position. And then all of that needs to be translated into equivalent code in Wayland. But Wayland has different concepts, so it's complicated. Is that something like what you were doing?
That's right. And the concepts of many things are actually quite different. So it's not a straight one-to-one, just finding the API calls that do the same thing. And that's, I think, why there's a bit of friction where people complain about Wayland, because all they want to do is this one thing they can do in X11. They can probably do it in Windows and Mac as well, and Wayland doesn't support it.
But isn't that the point of Wayland, that it's doing a better job than X was, and that's why we needed it?
Yes, but they've made some fairly opinionated decisions on things that they do and don't support. Like, for example, I'll give a few examples, but you can't set the window position, for example. Like, there's no concept of the global window position. which is something you might use if you have multiple windows. You might want to know the mouse location with relation to both windows, or have a window open in a particular position. There are some controls for this, but it's not as simple as just managing the position of all the windows globally.
And some of that is by design, right? I think it was ostensibly for security reasons, right? You don't want multiple applications being able to listen to events from each other as they could under X11. But does that mean, like, are there instances where something is not supported under Wayland, it was under X11, and have the developers of the protocol or whatever, have they addressed some of those issues and come up with ways that are usable by projects like Blender? I mean, Blender is a huge project in the ecosystem.
The things that aren't supported are specific enough to fairly isolated features that, generally speaking, we don't have to worry about it. So it's not like major features are broken in Blender because of Wayland.
It's mostly that was the X way of doing things, and now there's the Wayland way of doing things, and they're not particularly compatible.
Yeah. Like an example is we didn't have proper drag, or we still don't have proper drag and drop support between Blender windows. And we were sort of hacking things by just knowing the global coordinates of all the windows, so you could drag things between two Blender windows. But we really should have proper drag and drop support that runs at the operating system level. Like, just as you can drag from a file manager into the terminal, you should be able to drag from a Blender window to another Blender window using the operating system APIs for that. And we just didn't. It was just hacked in fairly quickly.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxdevtime.com/support.
Has there been any difference in the maintenance requirements for X11 versus Wayland? Is one of them harder or easier to support?
Wayland is definitely more complex. So X11, initially it's very simple, and then the complexity is all the workarounds and bug fixes you have to add. Whereas Wayland, it's initially more complex, although it does have its fair share of workarounds and bug fixes too, I discovered.
How do you feel about the code that supports Wayland versus how do you feel about the code that supports X?
I mean, generally Wayland, I'm much, much happier with it, because there are things that you have to do with X11 that are very, very inefficient. Like, just as an example, we have to do a very inefficient DPI, lookup query the XRDB database, I think, many times a second, because we don't know when the DPI will change on the user's monitor. So it's continuously looking for the DPI. And it's really silly. Like, maybe we could fix that or investigate better ways of doing it, but that's what it's doing at the moment on X11. And with Wayland, you get an event. This DPI has changed. You need to update the windows.
You've kind of alluded to this a couple of times now, but it sounds like it was like really properly hard.
Yes, it really was.
So, like, why? Tell us a bit more about that.
So my experience was I enabled Wayland on Linux and just started to look at the bug reports, and we did have sort of a laundry list of things we knew had to be supported before it was enabled by default. So I went through those and started supporting them. And then once it was enabled for the daily builds, that's when the bug reports started coming in. So the good thing about having quite a lot of users, even on Linux, is you get a lot of bug reports. And I suppose just generally speaking, I was surprised at the differences between the different Wayland compositors and the number of things that would work on one compositor and not on another. And supporting the different compositors was something akin to web browsers in the late 90s. It's like there would just be features to do with event handling, whether the modifier was detected as held when the window was activated, that would act differently depending on the different compositors. And when it's some quirk that users can just ignore, like no problem. But when it's, the modifier keys being detected as held when they're not, users really notice that. So yeah, we ran into a lot of issues like that. And it's particularly a problem because I was hoping you'd have KDE, GNOME, and WL roots-based compositors. But even within the WL roots-based compositors, there's quite a lot of wiggle room as to how they implement the event handling and the windows being activated. And maybe I should just mention the way Wayland's architecture works is it's interface-based rather than being sort of one big event loop. And that's one of the big differences with implementing an application using Wayland is you register an interface to listen to events from the tablet. You register an interface to listen to touch events. The interface is a version. So the compositor can give you an interface of a certain version, which you can reject if you don't support that one, or there can be all sorts of features that you can support or not. And that's really, really good because when you look at X11 and Windows and Macintosh, you see how over time the systems haven't very cleanly integrated new features. Things have come along, multi-monitor support, tablet events, different keyboard features, and it's often fairly obviously a hack that they had to use to support that in those systems. So with Wayland, they can gracefully add support for new systems and remove support for the old ones, and the applications just register the interfaces that they support, and if they don't support it, that's fine. It's not like a linking error or a symbol not found and the application doesn't start. So that's really nice. The problem with that is something a little bit like microservices, although they're not microservices, but the problem is that then the complications and the bugs end up being between the different interfaces that are sort of these isolated components that you've registered. You've got these callbacks that run, but in what order do they run? Does the window leave event callback run when you turn the monitor off, for example? Things like this. And so we've had bugs where someone turned all their monitors off and there's no monitors to display and then Blender crashes. Things like this. So the problem with this is there's also variation. So the different WL roots-based compositors and the other compositors can all run these callbacks in different orders with slightly different arguments. And when things don't work properly, it takes quite a while to troubleshoot to find out that it's even a bug in a certain compositor. So someone will just report a bug that Blender's, the cursor input's not being accepted or something. It may take me quite a while to find out that that's a bug in GNOME or something.
So that's even harder than we originally thought, right? It's not just the difference from X11. There's a difference between all these different compositors.
Yes. It really was a lot worse than I expected, and it's made a little worse by there's not like an official way to request which compositor are you using. There's an environment variable, and mostly it's set, and you can mostly depend on it, but it's not 100% reliable. More importantly, there isn't a way to check which version of which compositor you're adding. So in one case, we even need to detect a bug in the compositor to know that another bug needs a workaround.
So you're telling me that unlike with Windows and Mac OS, where there's like a few potential versions that you're targeting, with Linux, you've got all the different distros, and whether it's X11 or Wayland, and whether it's a bunch of different compositors, that just sounds like a nightmare.
Well, it feels like I'm throwing them under the bus, but it is quite bad because they may fix a bug, which is great, but if there's an LTS with a version of that compositor that's being used by people, like that bug's just not getting fixed. I suppose unless it's a security issue, it may do, but in practice it doesn't. And look, if the bug was really severe, maybe we could work around it. I have worked around quite a few bugs, so I think the worst of them I've worked around, but it is pretty bad.
And how often are the differences between compositors to do with bugs in the compositors, and how often are they things that are not clearly defined or could easily be implemented either way in the different compositors?
Oh, every now and again it happens. And sometimes the Wayland spec doesn't properly, it's ambiguous, particularly with the order that things are called, or if a callback is actually called or not. Like often it states it, but every now and again it doesn't. And sometimes the compositors just don't follow the spec.
How frequently is the Wayland protocol changing, or rather that spec?
Once every few months, I think, something like that. But there's a bit of a catch-22, I think, because the compositors don't have applications to test the new features with, and the applications don't have a compositor. So sometimes you add support for a functionality that you can't actually test.
Oh, wow.
You just know that the callbacks are there and they should work, but none of the compositors support it, so you just hope for the best.
Is there any kind of reference implementation for Wayland?
There is Western, and so I do test with that once in a while. I don't think many people use it daily, so we don't get bug reports about it. It seems to work fairly well, but I don't have much more to say.
It sounds like we haven't really touched on all the challenges yet that you faced.
I suppose there was a couple of challenges. One of them was client-side decorations, server-side decorations. This is a whole big argument for Wayland, and from our perspective, it's not really our place to say what should be done. It's just the fact that on GNOME you don't have server-side decorations, so we had to add our own decorations.
Can you just explain what decorations are?
Like the little picture around your window that has a maximize button and a title bar and the graphics and the resizability and all that. And GNOME, it's a kind of annoying. It is annoying because they do support it on X11. So if you have an X11 application, they do the window decorations. But if you have Wayland, you don't get them and you have to draw your own. And this is an opinionated decision. And the idea, I think, is that you will have a better user experience because each application will have like nicely integrated window decorations. But it does mean that there's a particular category of applications, game engines, emulators, video players, where you don't really care that much about the window decorations. You just want them to be there and to move on with life. And so that was an issue for us. And so Christian Rauch, as well as doing the Blender port, he wrote a library that you can just load that does the window decorations for you. And in principle, this seems like a really nice solution. You have a window decorations library, Blender calls out to that, and it manages all the decorations. In practice, there were quite a lot of integration issues, not really Christian's fault, but it's just issues with Blender communicating to its decorations. And when the decorations disagree, you get these horrible bugs where the window decorations are off in the distance and the Blender window's over here, and you just look like you don't know what you're doing. And that actually happened quite a lot with high DPI support when the window decorations are not high DPI aware and the window is, and you get all sorts of problems to do with that. The other problem I ran into, which was really quite bad, was Wayland's event handling. The way that it manages events is it builds up a queue in the background. If your application's main loop is hanging because of some single-threaded process, the events can build up and just overflow, the window closes. As far as the user's concerned, the application's crashed, although technically it's just lost the connection to Wayland. And we discovered this fairly late in the release process. So it was maybe a week or two before we were going to do the official release. And there was a bug where the user waved their mouse for a long time over the window while it was saving or something, and then it crashed. And I thought this was some obscure bug not to worry about, but when I looked into it, it turns out you can wave your mouse, depending on the mouse, can generate more events. You can actually crash the window within about 4 or 5 seconds, just because there's a single-threaded application, it's hanging because it's saving or doing a network connection from Python, who knows. But you can crash it pretty easily. And so at that point, I spent quite a bit of time to check if that buffer could be expanded or extended. Turns out this is a known issue, and there isn't any solution besides doing threaded event handling. And so threaded event handling on its own, that maybe seems not such a big deal. You have a thread that handles events, but this meant any of the Wayland callbacks, for which there are many, could run from a non-main thread, which meant locking needed to be implemented for every single handler, and the responses to those events needed to properly manage the locks. And that was really, really difficult to manage, and it took quite a while to get it all working properly.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It really was quite bad. And it's one of the reasons I'm not quite so positive about Wayland, because I looked and SDL has this problem too. It's not a Blender specific issue. If you make an SDL application and do a sleep and wave your mouse, you can close the window as well. It is resolved in Qt and GTK because they do threaded event handling. But it basically means, you get a Hello World program for Wayland and you think, oh yeah, this is how it should be implemented. But really, if you want an application that people are using and that people are relying on, you can't just use like simple event handling. You need to do it in a thread. And the threaded event handling made the window decorations integration quite complex as well.
So it sounds like this whole process was something of an ordeal, but there is a happy ending, right? You've now got it working on Wayland mostly, and yeah, there's still work to do, but you are now way more future-proof on Linux than you were before this ordeal started.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, and there are also benefits to handling events in a thread. And, if we add client-side decorations, which I think we probably should do, like there'll be benefits to that as well. So yeah, it is sort of this short-term upfront work, but for long-term benefits. And yeah, I'm quite happy with Wayland generally, and it will be nice when we get to remove X11 support.
Well, it's been absolutely great having you on, Campbell. We'll link to Blender, and I think there's a blog post about Wayland support that we can link to, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes as well. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
I've been Andy.
And I've been Campbell.
See you later.